la bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
What's up, everybody? This is Ramiro. Welcome to episode 3, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. Today, we're talking about Nicaragua against imperialism. Nicaragua in Central America, a very beautiful, inspirational country on the front lines of the struggle against U.S. imperialism. And today we're going to be talking about the attacks that Nicaragua is facing from the empire, from the belly of the beast. And joining us today is a good comrade, Aminta Zea, who is a Nicaraguan-American sociologist based out of New Orleans, Louisiana. She currently researches transnational Central American identity, imperialism in the Americas, and different modes of social struggle and labor organizing. Aminta participated, as well as myself, both of us participated in the March 2021 delegation to Nicaragua with the Sanctions Kill Coalition and the ATC, the Asociación de Trabajadores del Campo. Shout out to the ATC. Shout out to Sanctions Kill Coalition. How's it going, Aminta?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on your program. I'm so excited to be here.
Cool. I think your audio sounds kind of like alien-like. So maybe, yeah. So why don't you try taking off the AirPods and then we could just speak normally. It sounded like you were coming in from Mars. Okay.
Okay. Let me.
Much better. Cool. Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you great. Yeah.
It sounded like a transmission from Mars. You're like, I am visiting your planet. But yeah, Aminta, I wanted to get you on the podcast and speak to you because, as we just mentioned, we just got back from Nicaragua. We were in Nicaragua from March 13th to the 24th. Well, at least I was there for a short period of time. I wanted to stay longer. You just got back a few days ago, and I'm jealous that you got to stay longer and enjoy your time out there. But today we wanted to talk a little bit about the media war against Nicaragua, and Nicaragua being on the front lines of anti-imperialist resistance of the war against U.S. imperialism, because a lot of times Nicaragua, unfortunately, gets left out of the discussion within the left and the U.S. and broader. You know, we hear a lot about Cuba and we hear a lot about Venezuela and Iran. And, you know, of course, we are in solidarity with those countries and those movements against empire. And a lot of times, unfortunately, Nicaragua, which is the bastion of resistance and revolution in Central America since the 70s, is often left out. So it's really important for us to speak about that, to talk about the legacy of the Sandinista Revolution, and the Nicaraguan people to this day continue to fight against U.S. imperialism, U.S. empire. And so I wanted to just kind of introduce the topic. And I think you're somebody who, you know, because both of us were on the delegation, and we also have a special guest who's going to join us in a second, was also part of the delegation, to talk a little bit about Nicaragua, because I don't think too many people on the left in the US are well informed about it. And even a lot of so-called leftists and socialists were supporting these imperialist-backed protests in 2018. And so I think today will be a good chance for us to talk about the legacy and the impact of Nicaragua and the Sandinista Revolution. Before I go into a brief overview of Nicaragua's history, because I think that's also important for people who are really unfamiliar with the history of Nicaragua, I just want to introduce a good comrade who was also on the delegation to Nicaragua, Camarada Zero, who was part of the delegation as well, is joining us, is through and through socialist, revolutionary, and Sandinista supporter. How's it going, Camarada Zero?
I'm doing good. It's good to be up in here. Anti-Conquista, Unmasking Imperialism, with you two comrades that I was part of the delegation to Nicaragua with. Feeling good. I'm out here in Colombia in my roots. I'm a Colombian American. Feels good to be here in the homeland of Bolivar because we're a Bolivarian homeland, republic. And it's good to report on the homeland of Sandino. Which out.
That's what's up, Camarada Zero. It's dope to be able to speak with you and Aminta. I had a good time with both of y'all in Nicaragua. We got to know each other a little better, and y'all are really dope. Y'all two are people who I know right off the bat. You ever meet people and right off the bat, you know, like, oh, okay, I'm going to vibe with this person. This person's cool. This person's not cool. And I know for both of you comrades, you're both dope-ass people who are really cool and are really involved in some revolutionary work. And so before we get into going over some of the examples of the media war against Nicaragua, against the Sandinista Revolution, I just want to give folks a brief overview of Nicaragua's history. We're talking about a country in Central America that is historically one of the most impoverished because of imperialism, because of colonialism, one of the smallest countries in the hemisphere, but has such a root of resistance going back to the 1800s. And so I think an important place to start is the fact that, you know, obviously Nicaragua, as many other Central American countries, were part of the Spanish Empire, were colonized, were pillaged by Spanish colonialism. In the early 1800s, Nicaragua joined other Central American countries as part of the Central American Federation that was led by Francisco Morazán, who is from modern-day Honduras. Francisco Morazán is considered by many to be like the Bolivar of Central America. Shout out to Christina, by the way, who's watching and tuning in. And Morazán was important because his vision was of Central American unity, of unity against imperialism, because he understood that even though they were free from the Spanish, the U.S. was going to be the next empire and they had to remain united. And so in the 1800s, there was a Central American Federation. Nicaragua was part of that, as well as Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Unfortunately, in Costa Rica was a hotbed of resistance, of bourgeois nationalism to Central American unity. Morazán was eventually killed. The countries were fragmented and split, Nicaragua being one of the countries that was fragmented. And into the 1800s, you had a lot of attempts by the U.S., the rising U.S. empire, to try to colonize and expand, especially the Confederacy, into Nicaragua. You had somebody by the name of William Walker, who in 1855 or 1856 actually went to Nicaragua on a boat, some random white dude from fucking Tennessee or something, and was just like, I'm the president of Nicaragua now. What's good? I'm the leader. And this is an important part of the history because Nicaraguan anti-imperialism goes back to the mid-1800s. They still remember William Walker and what he did and his atrocities, going into their country, declaring himself president, and trying to expand the Confederacy into Nicaragua, establish a slave plantation as a country. And so eventually in Nicaragua, the forces of Florencio Satruch and others, a Honduran general, and the Nicaraguan people resisted William Walker and the U.S. imperialists. Later on in the early 1900s, you have the anti-imperialist hero known as Sandino, Augusto Cesar Sandino, who is one of the heroes, one of my favorite revolutionaries in Latin America. I actually got a shirt of him right now, Patria Libre o Morir, which is the slogan. Camarada Zero has a shirt with Sandino as well. So Sandino is a very revolutionary, inspiring Sandino mug. There you go. We got all decked out Sandino stuff. And he's somebody who is not only a anti-imperialist, a socialist, a revolutionary, but he's also indigenous. He's also organizing transnational movements. He's organizing with Farabundo Martí in El Salvador, who is the founder of the Central American Communist Party. He was organizing with José Carlos Mariátegui, writing letters in Peru. He was somebody who was very active, and he actually took up the armed struggle against the U.S. Marines in the 1920s when Nicaragua was still being invaded like every other week by the US. He directly confronted Marines in armed struggle. He was a guerrilla fighter. And unfortunately, he was captured and assassinated, but his heroic battle inspired the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional in the 60s, which was founded by Carlos Fonseca, Tomás Borja, and other revolutionaries who founded the Frente, the FSLN, which is today remains the ruling party of Nicaragua. In 1979, they had the Sandinista Revolution. That's the beautiful flag that they rock in Nicaragua of the Frente. And in 1979, the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional was actually able to overthrow the Somoza family dynasty, a dictatorship of white settlers, criollos, aligned with U.S. imperialism, aligned with the European capitalist class who was repressing leftists. We're talking about a family dynasty that ruled the country for 40, 50, 60 years, for a long time. And the Frente Sandinista overthrew them. They were building socialism. They were building campesino power related to the conditions of Nicaraguan society, blending socialism, Catholicism, Marxism, indigenous culture. And so immediately after the Sandinistas came into power in 1979, Reagan was elected in 1980. The US, they started the Contra War, the Contra Revolucionarios, counter-revolutionaries that were armed and trained in Honduras, where my family's from. And they not only were sent to try to attack and commit terrorist acts against the Nicaraguan people, but they also funneled drugs and money to the United States in cooperation with the DEA. And we're talking about revelations that came out from Oliver North, from Gary Webb, really important work in debunking the role of the Contras. And the Contras were branded as these revolutionaries, as these heroes, these pro-democracy freedom fighters in the mainstream media. And they were right-wing terrorists backed by the US, backed by CIA, who were bringing drugs into the US, crack cocaine. They were working in collaboration with the drug cartels in Colombia. They were bringing cocaine into the streets of New York, of LA, and also attacking the Panther movement, the Young Lords, the Brown Berets. And so the Nicaraguan people have been at the intersection of imperialism, of capitalism, of drugs, of all this stuff since throughout that time period. And a big reason Nicaragua does not necessarily have natural resources like oil that Venezuela has that's extremely valuable. I think with Nicaragua, what's most important and resourceful is its geopolitical position, located on one of the narrowest points of the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And for years, people have tried to construct a canal to connect both, to challenge the Panama Canal controlled by the US. And so Nicaragua has always been geographically positioned in a way that the imperialists have wanted that piece of land. And so into the 80s, the Sandinista government, led by Daniel Ortega, continued to fight against the Contras, continued to fight against the imperialists. Unfortunately, in 1990, during the election, Violeta Chamorro with the UNO coalition, a neoliberal government and faction, took over after the elections. They rolled back all of the progress on the Sandinista Revolution. And we're talking about a few years that the Sandinistas were in power, but it was so many accomplishments. The literacy campaigns, 1980, the alfabetización campaña that they started with the ATC, that we were just part of that delegation to help campesinos and poor people learn how to read and write. Women's liberation, nationalizing key industries, land redistribution, so many progressive policies that were instituted. And that was rolled back in 1990. So from 1990 to 2007, was a neoliberal period of Nicaragua, when Nicaragua was the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Everything was privatized, very similar to what Honduras is today. 2007, Daniel Ortega, who's the president now, and compañera Rosario Murillo, the vice president, who's also his wife, re-elected into power, and now is the government of unity and reconciliation, where they're building infrastructure, they're collaborating with Venezuela and Cuba, joining ALBA, joining CELAC, trading with Iran, Russia, China, building up the infrastructure and the means of production to uplift millions of people out of poverty. And they've done a really impressive job. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so that's just a brief overview of some of the history of Nicaragua for people who are unaware. And of course, in 2018, there were these US-backed protests against the government of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo that unfortunately so many people in the US left, in the first world left, fell for, and were like, oh my God, these are pro-democracy freedom fighters and heroes, and we need to support them. And so this is kind of the purpose of why we're having this conversation today, to talk about Nicaragua against imperialism, their unending struggle against imperialism, and what socialism in Nicaragua looks like today. So maybe starting off with you, compañera Aminta, why don't you, I don't know if there's anything you think I missed, or maybe you can tell us about your participation in the delegation, what you saw in Nicaragua just a few days ago, and what you think people should know about what's going on.
Sure thing. So I think one of the first things that comes to mind is noting that Nicaragua doesn't have a large exodus of migrants in the United States compared to Northern Triangle countries in Central America. And that is directly a consequence of the fact that the Frente has been able to increase the minimum wage. And prior to the NICA Act in 2018, which was an act that engaged in coercive, illegal, unilateral measures, otherwise known as sanctions, in order to bar the Nicaraguan government from having access to international finance loans. Prior to that, they were able to really continue to increase the well-being of its people to a higher extent. Granted, when a country is sanctioned, that really complicates the process. But one of the most revealing things, I think, on the delegation was seeing the brilliant and spectacular successes of the ATC alongside with its aid and help from the Nicaraguan government. And also, we see that you have a very strong political education, and the ideology, the socialist ideology in Nicaragua is very, very strong. And so those three things combined, we have this beautiful and incredible success of the country being over 80% food sovereign, of people being able to combat not only a soft coup in 2018, which, unfortunately, when you have to stay in your home for 3 months because of imperialist aggression, yes, it's going to impact your economy. And yet right now we see that their economy is still showing progress in spite of this, in spite of also an entire pandemic, and that the fact of the matter is that its people remain healthy. I, even felt much more healthier during my time there because the food that you eat is all organic. It's all grown in a way that is incredibly sustainable. And so in spite of all of these different challenges and struggles, the Nicaraguan people and its democratically elected government, because even like you mentioned before, you have some Western leftists that refuse to acknowledge that Ortega is supported by the people, they've been able to really come strong and be able to enact an important range of successes, and that they, continue to keep fighting. And there's so much that we can really take and learn from them, because they are the second, poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and yet, their people have housing. They're still able to build new housing communities, especially in Managua. We saw them when we were just driving by, and people are able to have access to healthy food. There's access to universal free healthcare in Nicaragua, which has also really helped, especially in light of the pandemic. So all of these different things combined, I think we need to pay close attention to when we're observing the material conditions that Nicaraguenses have now, and also understanding that they have a revolutionary history going back into the 20s, back into, Augusto Sandino and the spirit of resistance that the Nicaraguan people have enacted. I even want to mention one thing too briefly. I went to a bookstore, a children's bookstore, to send over some books to one of the children that we were staying with at the family in La Montañita in Esteli. And I bought a book for myself. It's called Bananos by Emilio Quintana. And it's a book that kids, when you're 13, 14, you have to read this and write a report. It's an anti-imperialist book that talks about the horrors of the banana republics in Central America. And it really goes to show that this anti-imperialist education, it starts young, because when you know how much your people have had to fight, you're going to know that you too have to progress in this ideology of the soberanía, sovereignty, of liberation, of taking care of one another, engaging in community, and operating on the basis of justice, and not falling for imperialist tactics or for short-term gains, because that's so much of what capitalism is, right? It's these short-term gains, this hyper-individualism. So those are some of the first things that come to mind. I know it's a lot, but it's really quite brilliant and inspiring to really see how Nicaragua has been able to push through and cómo sigue luchando, you know?
For sure. And shout out to Ian McShay. He said, say that title again, please. I'm going to have my son read that. It's called Bananos. What's it called?
Bananos. Yeah, Bananos by Emilio Quintana. I think you can get a PDF online. It's a short read. It's a small book, but that's great because that means it's accessible and you can have a really profound discussion about it.
That's what's up. And shout out to everybody watching, listening, by the way. Cristina, Orlando, who's one of the OGs, been following, listening to us for a minute. Camarada Zero, let's go to you. What'd you learn about Nicaragua? How's your experience being in Nicaragua? What'd you think about it?
Oh man, like I just fell in love with the country for so many different reasons. I mean, I just fell in love with like the people, the political project, the way that they're handling COVID-19, and just the way they have their economy mobilized, and also the way their people are mobilized out there. It's like you go through. It's like I feel like Nicaragua, and we spoke about this, Ramiro. It's like a hidden jewel that people don't really go into in the left. Like I went to Nicaragua because I wanted to complete my Troika of Resistance tour. You know, going to Cuba, going to Venezuela, and then going to Nicaragua. And then I realized how Nicaragua, it is very part of the Troika of Resistance. But now we have the quadrant, you know. I was making the joke on the delegation. Now we have Bolivia. So we could call it the quadrant of kiss my ass, U.S. imperialism. So, yeah, I mean, you go to Nicaragua and you just see the revolution. You just see like the culture everywhere, the statues of Sandino, the monuments to Carlos Fonseca, to Tamos Borges, and to other Latin American revolutionaries like Che, like Bolivar, and that big monument of Hugo Chavez. That it was just powerful, and understanding also about how everything is interconnected, like how the Cuban Revolution inspired the Sandinista Revolution, you know, to take up arms against the dictatorship, U.S.-backed dynasty of Somoza, and then you know the Frente lost their position in the 90s, like they say in Nicaragua, at gunpoint, because you had the U.S.-sponsored terror of the Contra Wars and also the blockades. And in the 90s, people wanted the end of the war, so they voted in the neoliberalist candidate of Violeta Chamorro, and they had 15 years of that neoliberalist government, and they saw the results of that. Like they saw a lot of the social gains that the Sandinistas won during the revolution being rolled back. And then with the wave of the pink tide, with the starting of Comandante Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in 1999, and you saw governments like in Bolivia with Evo Morales, in Ecuador with Rafael Correa, the Kirchners out in Argentina, that gave more confidence in El Pueblo to re-elect El Frente back into power. So it's like everything comes together when you go to Nicaragua. And just the fact that they have this rich history of resisting U.S. imperialism, U.S. intervention, going back into the 1800s with William Walker, like you spoke about it, Ramiro, you know, resisting a Confederate, you know, trying to expand slaveocracy, like trying to make connections with, like, say, the Black liberation struggle. Like Nicaragua is very connected with that. Even the fact also that you know, like we have this perception in the States of like how Nicaraguan like identity looks like. We think it's like we have this idea of like what Mesoamerica is, but like when Nicaragua, what I found interesting was when we were in the Mesoamerica side and we traveled to the Caribbean side, the coastal region, like Puerto Cabezas, Bilwi, or go to Corn Island and see that it's like a different culture of people because they speak the Creole English like the people speak the Caribbean English out in the like Jamaica or Trinidad, or their indigenous language of Mosquito. So they still speak Spanish, but that wouldn't be their first language, and they still say they're Nicaraguan.
Yeah, definitely. I think Camarada Zero froze for a bit. It looks like he got stiffened for a second. But nah, it's on point exactly where you're saying, comrade. It was beautiful to go. Back? Yeah, you're back. You were like,
what's the last part?
You're talking about the coast, how the coast is kind of like there's different diversities and nations within the nation, but
Yeah.
they're all Nicaraguan.
They're all Nicaraguan, and also they have their autonomous region. Like they have their own flag, they have their own party. I mean, Frente is there, you know. And I mean, people vote in Frente because of the respects they give to their ancestral practice, given the history of that region, given that the region was colonized by the English for a time. That's why the people speak the broken patois English. So it just shows, I guess, like the popular power which the Sandinista, the Frente government, has given to the Nicaraguan people. And as far as when we talk about like the food sovereignty, like what compañera Aminta spoke about, like 80%, the fact that they're not affected as much. They're a sanctioned nation, but they don't have that problem like Venezuela with food imports. They don't rely on that because their people grow their own food. So it goes to show that you cannot have political sovereignty without that food sovereignty. You know, like people control you by the food that comes in your belly, like, and it comes to your people's belly. So it goes to show the importance of agriculture, being connected to the land, and your people being able to feed themselves in order to be sovereign. You know, and that's a main part that I saw in Nicaragua. Also, the fact too, like just how peaceful it is. Like they make it sound like it's very dangerous. And it's just when you walk to the streets, it's just very peaceful. Like you can't believe like what you hear in the mainstream media. And also, like I gotta say this other point too, the fact that they call this like a socialist regime, but you see like outsiders having businesses in Nicaragua. Like me and compañera Aminta, we went to this nice like hotel in Corn Island, and it was owned by like this guy from Holland. And I'm laughing because I'm just like, this is a so-called socialist regime that allows people that come to the country to open up shop. And then when you ask this person about the government, you don't care about it. He's like against the government too. So it's just like, it kind of like this dilutes that whole propaganda.
Right.
We receive in the West about Nicaragua. Also on the other end, they're up for elections. Like you see, I have my bandana here, 2021. You know, our man Danielle gonna get it. But yeah, like the fact that if he gets voted in again, he has reasons to get voted in. I mean, he's ensured his people a peaceful nation, a sovereign nation, being proud of their history. Also, they're like having economic stability and also being able to manage COVID-19. The fact that they have the organic food, the fact that they have access to healthcare, and they're very well informed. So I think this is an important show that we're doing. So people on the left in the United States, especially Latinos, Latin Americans in the diaspora, could come to Nicaragua and visit Nicaragua and learn and absorb that.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point, Camarada Zero. And I'm glad you mentioned COVID-19 because there's a lot of recent propaganda that's already coming out election year. And so I want to just go over this article and see what you guys think about it. I'll read some portions of it. It's from The Guardian, of course, the head of liberal imperialism, of hipster imperialism. And just even the photos and the titles are fucking disgusting. I just picture some fucking snot-nosed white British dude like, Nicaraguan ruler Ortega rolls out vaccination campaign amid secrecy and doubt. It's just like the title itself is complete propaganda. And so I'm going to read some excerpts from it. So The Guardian basically says, the first person in Nicaragua to receive a coronavirus vaccine was Marco Antonio Arau, 62, who was given a dose of the Russian Sputnik 5 treatment at Managua's Blue Cross Hospital. Afterwards, he was quick to credit the country Sandinistas rulers. Quote, I'm very grateful to the government of Commander Daniel Ortega and his wife, compañera Rosario Murillo, because they are giving us a great opportunity to stay alive and for free, he told reporters from state media. And then he puts in parentheses, the only outlets allowed to attend, which is complete bullshit because they always allow all kinds of media to attend the events. Nicaragua is the only Central American country that has not introduced sweeping public health measures to contain the spread of COVID-19, and the only one not to have launched a testing campaign. So news of the vaccination in early March raised hopes that finally the government was taking action. Since then, however, Nicaragua's vaccination campaign has been rolled out amid the same secrecy and doubt that has characterized the authoritarian government's response to the pandemic. President Ortega has promised, quote, vaccines for all, but has not published any plans for the rollout, nor given details on which groups will be prioritized. Health officials make public expressions of gratitude to the president and his wife for the vaccines, which are donated by Russia, India, and the UN-backed COVAX program. Critics say that in an election year, the Ortega Murillo regime is using the vaccine campaign to boost their image, which had been battered by its handling of the pandemic and the brutal repression of an anti-government uprising in 2018. And the independent Nicaraguan Medical Association has warned that there is still no clear timeline or timetable for a universal vaccination program. And they quote some other piece of shit from the PanAmerican Health Organization. We're moving very slowly and there's not enough information, they said. From the start of the pandemic, the Sandinista government joined the chorus of denialist governments across the Americas, including Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Donald Trump in the US. So they're comparing Ortega to Bolsonaro and Trump. Officials downplayed the severity of the disease and held mass rallies of supporters. In the first few months, information on the pandemic was handled as a, quote, state secret. Officials attempted to hide the number of deaths with so-called, quote, express burials in which the bodies of COVID victims were rushed from the hospital for burial in the dead of night. As deaths surged between April and July of 2020, local media reported that officials concealed the scale of the disaster by falsifying death certificates to say that COVID victims had instead died of diabetes, pneumonia, or other illnesses. So it goes on, the article basically just goes on to shit on Nicaragua, to shit on the Sandinista government for its alleged mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Going to Nicaragua compared to the US was much better. I got my COVID test in a day, in a few hours. It was extremely efficient. It was run by the government, but it's better because they lower the price so that I paid less in Nicaragua to get a rapid COVID test than I did in the US because it's controlled by the government and it's not private companies that are monopolizing COVID testing, which is a big problem here in the US. And it was just extremely clean, efficient. I saw for myself, but the three of us saw for ourselves just a few days ago, if not a few weeks ago, how efficient Nicaragua was handling COVID-19. And I think the most beautiful part about it is that, yes, they did take it seriously. Yes, they did institute, masks and gloves and hand sanitizers. But the government said, look, we're not going to stop the country. We're not going to paralyze. We're going to allow people to continue their businesses, to continue to work, because we know if we stop everything, it's going to totally ruin our economy. And Nicaragua has handled COVID-19 way better than most countries in the region. They had some of the lowest deaths. And if you look at some of the resources that they look in the article that they link to, it's all these Western-controlled NGOs in Nicaragua that have routinely fabricated shit, including the 2018 protests. But compañera Aminta, what do you think of this article? I mean, there's so much nonsense in it.
There is so much bullshit in this article. When I read it, I was absolutely fuming. I want to go ahead and sort of give some context to, for example, the PanAmerican Health Organization, because I was doing some research earlier, seeing what is the origin of this organization. I know that later they also say that there's a Nicaraguan Medical Association and that, Nicaragua isn't following the guidelines of the PAHO. But when we really want to think a little bit more critically, right, because obviously this article is pushing for popular support against the democratically elected government of Nicaragua, we have to understand too that the PanAmerican Health Organization comes from the International Sanitary Bureau. This was founded in 1902 in Washington, D.C., explicitly as a mechanism to protect trade and investments from the burden of disease. So the International Sanitary Bureau focused on prevention and control of epidemics. One of the things that they were focused on was mosquito eradication campaigns and the implementation of a vaccine against yellow fever. This was something that many healthcare professionals in this organization were focused on in the early 20th century. And the reason why I mention this is because during that period, plans proceeded for the construction of the Panama Canal, the development of agricultural enterprises in the banana republics of Central and Northern South America, and the extraction of mineral resources as raw materials for industrial production from areas such as southern Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil. There was work in the tropics that demanded public health initiatives against mosquito-borne diseases like yellow fever and malaria, parasitic illnesses like hookworm, and other common viral and bacterial illnesses. And so the only reason why the International Sanitary Bureau was established was not because they were actually concerned over the public health of these of people in the global south, people in Latin America. It was like, oh, we're going to make sure that we have enough laborers for these transnational organizations, corporations, so that we can keep all of this wealth that we're hoarding through the means of imperialism and keep it in the global north. And so later in the 1950s, we see that the International Sanitary Bureau became the regional office for the Americas of the World Health Organization. In 1958, it changed its name to what we now know as the PanAmerican Health Organization. It said that its public health mission was broadened, but it retains a focus on the protection of trade until the present day now. And in general, it supports the provisions of these international trade agreements, which are stemmed to all the different organizations in this article. So when I laugh, because when I was reading this article, it was saying, the Independent Nicaraguan Medical Association. There was another one, I can't remember what it was called. It was like the Nicaraguan. It's one in relation to science. And I can't remember it off the top of my head right now, but the point of me bringing this up is the fact that, this article is trying to come off as if it doesn't have a bias. It's trying to come off as a journalistic piece, but it's completely inflammatory. It's just filled with a bunch of lies. And I think the three of us can agree, when we were in Nicaragua, I mean, God, I felt as if I could walk and I felt safe. I didn't feel this crippling anxiety and paranoia that I was going to get sick. People still wear their masks. I think it's a mixture of, and I hear from my own family members too. I have a lot of family in Matagalpa, and, they told me, yeah, COVID isn't as bad here in comparison to quote unquote developed countries, because also our diet is so much more healthier. Our lifestyle is healthier. We get to be outside, we're breathing fresh air. We take precautions when we need to, but that in combination with a universal healthcare system, in particular, one thing that I think is really interesting about the Nicaraguan government's free healthcare system is that they have a mode or model called the conceptual model of family and community health. And this engages in preventative healthcare, because they know that alongside with sanctions, you have to, make sure that your people are well taken care of, so you don't have an outbreak of folks that need perhaps medicines that are more expensive. And it's a decentralized method that, advances the health and the well-being of the citizens. And so it is just really, really infuriating to read this article. And, I think one thing we should do, especially as revolutionaries, as leftists here in the United States, is when these inflammatory articles come out, just quick Google searches about where these organizations come from, who is funding these organizations. I know that this article too was under the global development folder of The Guardian. I think that's what it's called. And the reason why I mention that is because that's funded by the Gates Foundation. And I mean, come on. I don't think I need to explain why Bill Gates is not a reliable source by any means, but it's these BS philanthropists who want to come off as impartial, or, that they're independent, but of course not. They're partial to imperialist interests that don't actually care about the health or well-being of people in the global South. They're collaborating with corporate interests to protect commerce and trade, not not working class people by any means.
That's a great point about the lack of impartiality, because even I studied journalism in undergrad in college, and all over the academy and social sciences we're told, oh, be objective, be impartial. But it's like everybody has a bias. Everybody has something that they represent. It's better to be real and open about what interests you represent. And it's just funny because they're playing on that in this article where they're like, oh, the state media was allowed to be there, but oh, these independent, nonpartisan, free-thinking institutions, they're cool. And it's just like they use that dichotomy to serve the interests of imperialism. That's one of the ways they do that. And it also plays into the racist understanding that especially white and wealthy people are more reasonable and less detached from emotion than poor working class Black and brown people. Because if it's a poor working class Black and brown person who's allied with the government, who's a Sandinista, who's saying, look, we're doing this with COVID-19, we're having all these successes against the virus, they're going to say, oh, they're just emotional, they're just biased, brainwashed. But if it's some random white dude who in Nicaragua who's like, oh, well, I don't know what side I represent, I'm on neither side, and he's independent, he's reasonable, and it plays into that racism. And I think in terms of health prevention, I think that's a great point. Even when I got back from Nicaragua, Ofelia, my girlfriend, she was like, damn, you look like you lost some weight. Like, you lost like 5 pounds or something. I was like, yo, all we were eating was fresh food, like fruit, tortillas, frijoles, gallo pinto, cheese. It's all non-GMO, it's no corporations. And I think it was a big difference from what I've seen in a lot of other Latin American countries, including Honduras, including Haiti, including Mexico, where people have no food sovereignty. It's all McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell, all these multinational companies that flood the market. They compete against the little mom and pop shops to wipe them out. And so now you have all these people with problems in the global south, diabetes, cholesterol, heart disease, and that contributes to COVID-19, of course. So in Nicaragua, instead of being like, these people in the picture where they're like, hey, let me inject you with this, and this, it's like, okay, before we get to that, let's make sure you're eating right. Let's make sure you're getting clean food, clean air, clean water. And that's the best way to prevent these sort of diseases. And I think people don't understand that in the West, where we're just so used to like commodities and pills and, let's inject you with this, as a way to deter against the virus. But Camarada Zero, what'd you think of this article? And what'd you think about how Nicaragua handled COVID from what you saw?
Yeah, I mean, this article that you can see is very biased, it's a lot of propaganda against how the Nicaraguan people are handling the crisis. I mean, we were all there. We all got to see that the people over there look healthy. Like, nobody looks like they're sick, or like doesn't look like I come from New York City, where it was the epicenter of the pandemic for a minute, and you saw the hospitals being filled with long lines. People had to mask up. People were sick. I mean, I hardly saw any of that in Nicaragua. I hardly saw any like hospitals filled up to capacity. And I mean, literally, I could say I was walking without a mask for like 3 weeks. I mean, in certain places you had to walk around with masks, like say in airports or like gas stations. But for the most part, like I didn't walk around with a mask, and I took my COVID-19 test and I came out negative. Like surprisingly. And like, right now I'm in Colombia, and in Colombia, people got to wear masks. And over here, like COVID is really bad, it's really high. And it just for me, it was like very hard because I'm coming from Nicaragua to Colombia. In Nicaragua, so used to not wearing the mask so much. Over here, I have to people constantly has to remind me to wear the mask. But yeah, talking about the food, you spoke about McDonald's. I remember I went to a McDonald's and I had a gallo pinto for breakfast. Like, so delicious. And gallo pinto, basically, for people who don't know, it's like the staple food in Nicaragua. Basically, it's like rice and red beans mixed with tortilla, queso, and plantains, what we call it maduro. And I had it for breakfast, so I had eggs on it, and it was very delicious, Yeah, like I hardly gain any weight eating food out there. I mean, here in Colombia, I've gained weight. I have to run when I get back to the States, but that's a whole different story. But yeah, I mean, this article is like like so just bullshit. Like just like basically like people in Nicaragua have access to healthcare, you know, and like their food is very it's healthy, it's natural, it's no GMOs, like y'all said. And also like one part that I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they mentioned this. Like the 2018 protests, so-called like student protests, those were like, they call it out there los tranques, because they were blocking the roads, affecting the economy. But those were not church school boys doing peaceful protests. Those were terrorist attacks. That was an attempt of a coup. And I remember, actually we were all there when we went to Masaya. I remember seeing like the graffiti from the protesters, and I know like coming from New York City and coming from like understanding like gang culture, that looked like gang graffiti. So you know, like La Mara, you know, like they say La Mara was a part of those tranques, that they came from El Salvador, from Honduras, to come into those protests and disrupt like the country. So like I saw that right there as evidence that these weren't no peaceful protests. These were just attempts of a coup, which failed. Because why? Because Commander Ortega is somebody who has experience in military combat. He knew how to handle that situation. He knew to tell the people in Nicaragua to allow them to protest for 3 months so people would see what they were about. And they really weren't about nothing. They were just about disrupting shit. They were about destroying shit. You know, they tried to destroy the monument to Comandante Chavez, and the people didn't allow that to happen. So, I mean, yeah, this whole article is full of BS and propaganda.
I'm glad you mentioned the 2018 protests, because I want to show y'all a clip from a Vice video produced after the 2018 protests, basically trying to brand these terrorists, these right-wing thugs as revolutionaries. And I want to get your responses to I'll just play a part of the clip to see what you guys think.
For almost 7 weeks, a protest movement led by university students took over Nicaragua. Protesters occupied campuses and controlled entire neighborhoods, demanding that President Daniel Ortega step down after 11 years in power. But then, in July, the president ordered a brutal crackdown. More than 300 people died and many others were imprisoned, according to an independent human rights group. Now, paramilitaries in ski masks keep the peace. The students were forced into hiding. A couple dozen of them now live together in a secret headquarters on the outskirts of Managua.
Buenas noches, desde Alianza Universitaria Nicaragüense aún le damos la bienvenida a este Facebook Live.
Lo que está haciendo Ortega es una negación total de la realidad, pues.
At 26, Harley Morales is one of the oldest.
¿Ustedes cuánto tiempo llevan acá en este lugar, escondidos?
Tenemos 2 meses ya, que es un estado de sitio de facto que tenemos ya aquí, pues, porque hay un estado de terror. Pues. O sea, nosotros no podemos salir como después de las 6 de la noche.
Cut off from the streets, the students look for ways to keep busy and keep up the pressure. They react on social media as the president gives interviews claiming victory and denying his involvement in deaths and disappearances.
Nosotros estamos leyendo que en este momento hay una suerte de empate, que lo podríamos llamar de empate catastrófico, destructivo, una contención mutua entre las fuerzas.
The protests started over narrow issues, including social security reform. But government violence brought an unlikely coalition onto the students' side, including peasants, the Catholic Church, and notably, big business, which until very recently was one of Ortega's vital allies.
Si ustedes ven que Ortega se aferra al poder y no está dispuesto a salir y les ofrece, digamos, un pacto beneficioso para ustedes, ¿ustedes estarían dispuestos a abandonar la alianza?
Fuimos claros como sector privado de que el modelo que se había tenido se había acabado para siempre desde el primer muerto.
But the students worry that the corporate class will grow tired of the stalemate.
Nosotros no tenemos los intereses que ellos tienen, porque para mí democracia no es simplemente que se den elecciones libres. Para mí democracia no es simplemente que se dé un recambio de élites políticas aquí. Decimos justicia, democracia, pero también yo le agregaría igualdad y bienestar. Pues.
El empresariado, digamos, la élite económica, yo me imagino que ese tipo de discurso, ese tipo de proyecto no le atrae mucho, ¿no? There are those in the opposition who have no patience for peaceful tactics. In July, protesters murdered a police officer and burned his body in the street. Cuando tú ves algo así, ¿qué piensas? ¿Cómo reaccionas a eso?
Lo repudiamos completamente. Nosotros sabemos de lo que es capaz el pueblo. Nosotros sabemos de que el pueblo tiene la capacidad de armarse, de que los campesinos no les tiembla el pulso de venir hasta aquí con armas.
Si eso llegaría a pasar, ¿qué postura tendrían ustedes frente a eso?
Que yo creo que es poco estratégico. En una correlación de fuerza militar nosotros perderíamos.
Ortega has tried to paint the opposition as a right-wing regime change operation backed by the U.S.
Nuestra atención no está en Washington, están en Nicaragua.
There is truth to this. Republicans have cheered the prospect of Ortega's downfall.
Daniel Ortega, the Marxist president of Nicaragua, has proven his brutal disregard for basic human liberties over and over again.
But claiming U.S. interference only goes so far in Nicaragua, where much of the left is aligned against Ortega, in spite of his credentials as a guerrilla in the Sandinista Revolution. In fact, many of his former comrades in arms have turned against him. They see in him echoes of Anastasio Somoza, the very same brutal dictator that the Sandinistas toppled in 1979.
Te muestro, esta es del comando que asaltó la casa de Chema Castillo.
Es gracias a este comando que lo incluía usted, que Daniel Ortega salió de la cárcel.
Efectivamente, o sea, a su libertador, le va a aplicar la condena según él, ¿verdad? Eso está por verse, ¿no?
So basically they go into some more bullshit. That's from Vice, classic liberal imperialist hipster propaganda. These two fucking idiots look like they just came out of a vegan coffee shop in Williamsburg. And it was just really disgusting to see that, because it's just a classic example of how imperialism works, of how they use that hipster imperialist narrative to brand the opposition as these Democrats, as revolutionaries. What do you guys think, comrade? Let's start with compañera Aminta.
Of Vice, when I first think of Vice, I am reminded of the time I spent in the Venezuelan embassy and the horrible lack of honest journalism from the reporter that was sent outside of the embassy. I remember it was some, again, hipster white girl that definitely looked like a total gentrifier in New York City, right? And she didn't even speak to any of the people that were part of the Embassy Protection Collective, or any of the folks that were also part of the Protection Collective on the outside. She only spoke to these right-wing Venezuelans. I might also mention there were some right-wing Nicaraguenses out there too. And so that's the sort of general vibe I get from Vice. So I can't say that I'm surprised when I see a video like this. And I think it's really inflammatory and awful that they try to diminish the entire conflict surrounding Social Security, because it was pressure that the World Bank and the IMF put on the Nicaraguan government to increase the age that you can retire. And Ortega said, no, we're not going to do that. And so as a result, what do you end up having are paramilitaries and a right-wing backed coup attempt in 2018. It wasn't students. I think that it's deliberate manipulation to say that it were students, young people, rebels per se, that, you know, are against the government, because that is maybe how you can, you know, convince a certain group of people in the United States to believe that that is the narrative that was to be true, right? Because people are more sympathetic to young people that are choosing to fight back per se. But that is not what happened in Nicaragua. I remember going in 2019 for myself. You know, want to mention too, I didn't go to visit family. This is the first time I traveled the country by myself. And mind you, I felt extremely safe for a 19-year-old that was very naive, and, just traveling alone. And I spoke to people, for example, Masaya. Masaya is about 25 minutes driving outside of Managua and was very heavily hit by los tranques. I met a group of artisans in the market, and they talked to me about, how so much of the imperialist media was completely ignoring the fact that, one, the majority of the people do support Ortega. Ortega was elected with I think he was elected with 72% of the vote in the last election year. And you go around and, people do rep el frente. The liberal opposition is just so ridiculously weak. La Lancia Cívica doesn't have any sort of political power. It's why they had to resort with, the funding and backing of imperialist institutions in order to enact terror and to try and do something. And they failed. And they failed again because the majority of el pueblo nicaragüense stands behind and supports the Sandinista movement. I want to really emphasize that it is a movement, and because of the ideology that's presented there, it is why Ortega has been receiving so much support, and also the fact that, one of the kid that was talking there, he was like, "Oh, there's no democracy here," and then I'm just like, "What the hell are you talking about?" I don't know if you guys remember when we were in Bilwi in the Northern Autonomous Caribbean Zone and learning about, all of the indigenous representation, the Mezquita representation in the Nicaraguan government, how constitutionally you need to have like 50% women, 50% men, in engagement. And we talk about representation, right? Because I think about representation here in the United States and, how difficult the misuse of identity politics conflates that. And so we'll see certain people in U.S. government, Kamala Harris, and people are like, oh, she's a Black female president or Black vice president, that's progress, but it's like, no, it's not, because she still represents the interests of the ruling class. But then you look at Nicaragua, look at their incredible revolutionary process and the actual democratic processes that have enacted there that have allowed for 2 autonomous indigenous regions in the country. It makes up almost half of all the land that's there. And so I'm looking at this kid and I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? That there isn't any democracy. And it's so ridiculously infuriating, because for everybody who's listening and watching, I really urge folks to go to Nicaragua and visit for yourself. And Nicaraguenses are very friendly. You'll never have a Nicaraguense that'll push you away. They'll talk to you, and you'll see, even if you do meet somebody who isn't a Sandinista, like, they're not being repressed or imprisoned. I remember going to Granada in 2019 and even seeing posters about meetings for La Alianza Cívica. It wasn't like, they were still allowed to be up there. They were still allowed to meet. So what the hell are you talking about? Some sort of repression when that is just so far from the case. So fuck Vice and their stupid bullshit hipster imperialist narrative, the only really appealing to gentrifier, petty bourgeois young people in the United States that also.
Yeah,
so
that's a great point. And shout out to the comrades watching and listening. Toward the end, part of the Vice clip got taken down for a second, so we already know Silicon Valley's unhappy with our commentary exposing Vice and other imperialist media, but luckily we're back, we're good, and we heard everything you said, compañera Aminta, and it's facts. It's just another example. People continue to fall for it. People continue to think that just because people continue to believe that all protests are revolutionaries and all governments are reactionary, and they have used that. The imperialists have used that as a way to try to take down Venezuela. We see that them trying to do that now with Cuba, with them funding hip hop and these right wingers. Compañero Camarada Zero, what do you think about that Vice clip? And maybe why don't you just close off for us what you think people can learn from Nicaragua?
Yeah, so my thing is, we have to make an assault on Vice News. My name is, I call myself Camarada Zero, after a Sandinista named Comandante Zero that did a famous assault on the national building when it was Somoza. Now that wait, it's the National Congress or National Assembly, that building?
I think it's the National Congress.
There you go. But now it's the Congress of Culture, where people practice art, people practice music. I remember chilling there. I love chilling over there. And I met with some hip hop rappers, MCs, and I started rapping, and they love my New York swag. That's a whole nother story. But we're making an assault on Vice News, you know what I mean? And we try to make people check out Anti-Conquista because we're against the conquista, of people's minds with all this propaganda. It's just absurd. The fact that they try to paint these so-called student protests as rebellious, try to take this aesthetic from the left and create this thing that we all know as a color revolution. They tried it with the guarimbas in Venezuela a year before. They tried it with Hong Kong. They tried it now this year with that whole fake hip hop movement of San Isidro over there in Cuba, that you could find pictures of these so-called rappers with Luis Almagro, part of the Organization of American States, which Castro calls the Organization of the American Colonies. So we have to let people know that just because people start talking about that they're revolutionary and they hold up all this rebellious young aesthetic, doesn't mean that they're revolutionary. At the core, they're trying to in a way promote the recolonization of their homelands, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Venezuela, and whether it's Nicaragua. In this case, it's very interesting just because, like I said before, when we went through Masaya, I saw the graffiti, of them saying something about sapos, sapo is fish, but that's it's a derogatory term for Sandinistas. And I laugh because the sapo frogs, they eat gusanos, they eat the worms, it's you're not hurting nobody with those words, but yeah, the graffiti, the style, that's purely gang, that's purely MS-13. And we know very well that when I was in Nicaragua, I learned that a lot of this operation was from Costa Rica, supposedly the Swiss of Central America, but now we know it's being converted into the Miami of Central America because you got all the gusanos going over there. The Nicaraguan expats, the Colombian drug dealers, the Venezuelan escualidos, the Cuban gusanos, where they do the operations against Nicaragua from over there, and they funnel the money towards these gangs, these paramilitaries from Honduras, from El Salvador. That's why the Nicaraguan military had to block that border to not let them come into the country. So that's one thing. Also, this whole thing of demonstrating the youth that they don't support their government. The youth in Nicaragua supports their government. That's why you have the birth of Revolución, and shout outs to them. They created their platform on Instagram to demonstrate how their youth, like us, that support Sandinismo, the Sandinista Revolution. I have one sister that I did an awesome interview with tell me that it's crazy the type of nationalism they were trying to push with these protests. It's this fake nationalism of what Nicaraguanism is. She said you cannot divorce that flag, that blue and white flag, from the red and black. They are one, they go one together. It's the perfect marriage. Just the fact that also the opposition, they don't like a figure like Cesar Sandino. Why? Because they're a bunch of white racist criollos. They hate the fact that the father of the homeland of Nicaragua was an indigenous peasant, a revolutionary guerrilla peasant. And I say this as somebody who's Colombian, and my forefather, he comes from a slave, like Simón Bolívar comes from a slave elite, but later on in his life, he would be part of the pueblo. He'd be one with the people. But this differs with Cesar Sandino, that he's a indigenous campesino guerrilla fighter, and the opposition wants to reject him. While the Nicaraguan people, the real people, el pueblo, el frente, recognize him because he brought back dignity to the homeland. He brought back respect, and he wanted the unity of Nicaragua. He wanted the unity between Mesoamerica and the Caribbean. I remember I had an interesting question between Sandino's relationship with the Afro Nicaraguans. And he always wanted, and this goes into perfect point. He always wanted like roads to connect the Mesoamerica part, which is Managua, Masaya, Granada, Leon, with those sides of Bluefields and Puerto Cabezas. And you see it very well done in Nicaragua with this government, because they got one of the best roads in Central America. I remember traveling around Nicaragua and seeing like, whoa, these roads are smooth. I'm somebody that hardly drives, but I could realize these roads are smooth. And they say it's one of the best in Central America. So it goes to show how, you know, the people, of course, they're supporting the Frente, the FSLN, because it's so integral to their homeland. It's who they are. It's their sovereignty and how they pay respects to the people who have died, who have shed blood for a Nicaragua that is of today, a Nicaragua that's peaceful, a Nicaragua that provides education, a Nicaragua that provides healthcare, that provides culture, that's food sovereign, you know, that's anti-imperialist. It might not be perfect. No country's ever perfect, but they are allowed to be imperfect because they're a sovereign nation and they're an anti-imperialist nation. So with those tranques, you know, like they say in Nicaragua, no pudieron ni podrán. You know, they couldn't and they're not going to, because the Sandinista Revolution, just like the Cuban Revolution, just like the Bolivarian Revolution, is here to stay, motherfucker.
Ni pudieron. Yo, that's a great way
also,
to.
Also, I gotta also say this too. One last thing.
Yeah.
I had to get this, you know, because I was in Nicaragua and I was finishing my Troika resistance tour. I got this right here.
That's what's up. That looks mad tough. That looks fresh. I needed to get one too. That's what's up. But yeah, Camarada Zero, it's really inspiring to hear everything you had to say about Nicaragua, and I'm glad that it really touched you personally and that you were inspired by the country. And oh yeah, you had one last thing you wanted to say.
I didn't say this before. I forgot to say this because Aminta made me remind me when we did the separate trips from Esteli and I was in Jinotega, that I remember when I was in a classroom with children, you know, like it was in a rural area, and y'all know what I'm about to say. I remember I made a video where I was like, Sandino vive, and they all said, all of them, these are just little kids. They said, La lucha sigue, without nobody telling them anything, you know? And it just demonstrates also like, it's really here to stay for the next generation. Like basically I said that Sandino lives, and they said that the struggle continues. And these are just like little kids, and they had that formation. It was just like, wow, you know? That's really what I took with me.
The revolutionary inspiration of the youth is beautiful. The Sandinista youth, the kids from 5 years and up, they're proud about Sandino. They're proud about Carlos Fonseca, Tomás Borja, and their president, Commander Daniel Ortega. Compañera Aminta, why don't we wrap up with you, just kind of closing off. What advice would you have for people who want some good alternative media about Nicaragua? What sources to look for? And any last words or comments about Nicaragua's revolution?
Sure thing. So obviously, Anticonquista is always spectacular when it comes to information on Nicaragua. I would also want to boost the Gray Zone as well. They, especially in 2018, were really publishing a lot, debunking what was really going on. I'd also want to give a shout out to the Friends of the ATC website really does a phenomenal job at really breaking down what's happening. Tortilla con Sal as well. I know that one of our compañeras on the trip, was working alongside with one of the members on there. And then is it Juventud Presidente as well, that I'm sure they also have different publications that kind of tell you what's going on in the country. I would even also want to add different universities in the country as well. If you go on like the UNAN website, you can probably see what academics in Nicaragua are publishing. Also the Urraca school, which is the autonomous university in Bilwi and in the Northern Caribbean coast. I think that those would also be really helpful resources for people who are interested in kind of getting more research. So the information is out there. You just have to, look, because Google, if you just look up Nicaragua, what's happening in Nicaragua, they're going to give you all of the right-wing imperialist media, as they themselves being a giant private corporation. And so, really having the opportunity to be in community with my fellow Nicaraguenses, with my fellow comrades in North America, having the opportunity to hang out with both of you guys, mis hermanos en la lucha. It's been so much fun. And I'm so happy that we were able to really have this brilliant and enlightening discussion about what's going on in Nicaragua, because especially now with Nicaragua being an election year, we have a lot of media that we know is going to be coming out that is against not only Ortega, but when you are against Ortega, you are also against the people who support Ortega. And the majority of those people are working class people. They are campesinos. They are people in the autonomous regions. They're people who have also fought for their autonomy and for their liberation, and whose forefathers also fought for that. So vamos a continuar acá en la lucha como para siempre. We're always fighting, ensuring that, when we have a Nicaragua that is successful and that can triumph, hopefully that is a beacon of light for all other Latin American countries and all of the unique struggles, that not just encompass, Central America, but all of Latin America and also all of the global South. So all eyes on Nicaragua, and I hope that, we come out strong this election year, and that 2021 brings us closer towards building a stronger and more unified anti-imperialist movement.
Most definitely, compañera Aminta. It was really great to speak with you, as well as Camarada Zero. Aminta is a Nicaraguan-American sociologist based out of New Orleans. Shout out to NOLA. Currently researches transnational Central American identity, imperialism in the Americas, and different modes of social struggle and labor organizing. Aminta, as well as Camarada Zero, who's waving the flags of the Frente in Nicaragua. All of us participated in the delegation to Nicaragua with the Sanctions Kill Coalition and the ATC. Shout out to Sanctions Kill. Shout out to ATC. We miss everybody in the delegation. Y'all were a good pleasure to be with. I hope to chill with y'all again soon. Peace out, everybody. Thanks for watching, listening, and tuning in. Traidores, leales siempre. Leales siempre. Peace out, comrades. Take care.
Bye.